Yesterday, the BBC sacked Scott Mills. 5 days. Complaint came in, and he was gone by the weekend. The Metropolitan Police confirmed they'd already investigated Mills between 2016 and 2018 for alleged serious sexual offences. The CPS decided there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. He's not been convicted of anything. And that matters. I want to be clear about that up front. But here's what also matters. The BBC got rid of Mills in 5 days. It took them 50 years to deal with Jimmy Savile, and even then, he died first. Their highest paid newsreader was caught with Category A abuse images, and they kept paying his salary for months. 5 days for Mills, 50 years for Savile. What changed? Not the morality, the PR risk. Because I'm not about to make a video about Scott Mills. Mills is just the latest name on a list. And that list, that's what should keep you watching. Because the pattern behind it is worse than any single case. And the thing that should probably make your blood boil, you're actually paying for it by law. Right, so let's start with what the BBC did when people tried to tell them. Because the story everyone knows is that Jimmy Savile was a monster who got away with it. And that's true. But the bit that tends to get skipped over, the bit that makes this institutional rather than individual, is what happened when people actually tried to raise the alarm. A 16-year-old girl complained about being by Savile during a Top of the Pops recording. She was told she must have been mistaken. Then she was escorted off the premises. A junior employee at Television Centre was assaulted. She reported it. Her supervisor told her, and I'm quoting directly, "Keep your mouth shut, he is a VIP." A musician called Ian Hampton saw Savile leaving BBC premises with young girls twice, reported it twice, was told not to be silly the first time, and not to be ridiculous the second. And if you think those are just isolated bits of bad luck, maybe a few managers having a bad day, the Dame Janet Smith review counted 8 formal complaints about Savile during his BBC career. 8. Want to know how many were investigated? Bet you can guess. 0. Not a single one. 8 complaints, 0 investigations, and 117 BBC employees had some knowledge of what Savile was doing. A gap in the system? No. The system was working exactly as designed. But it gets worse, because while BBC journalists were actually gathering evidence of Savile's crimes, real testimony from real victims, BBC management made a choice. In November 2011, weeks after Savile died, the Newsnight team had the story. Reporter Marion Jones and journalist Liz McKean had gathered testimony. Their editor gave them the green light. His exact words were full steam ahead. Then senior management got involved. The deputy director of news pulled the investigation off the internal risk register. The editor suddenly decided he didn't even need to watch the interview footage, and by December, the story was dead. And over Christmas 2011, while sitting on that evidence, the BBC broadcast 4 tribute programmes to Jimmy Savile. 4 glowing tributes to a man their own journalists had established was a prolific rapist. ITV eventually broke the story, not the BBC. Their own story handed to a competitor because management preferred the tributes. Jeremy Paxman later told the Inquiry that Savile's abuse was common gossip at the BBC. Helen Bowden, director of news, apparently told the Director General about the Newsnight investigation at a drinks party. The tributes ran anyway. The Director General, who oversaw that mess, George Entwistle, he lasted 54 days, the shortest tenure in BBC history. The Pollard Review said BBC management systems were completely incapable of dealing with the crisis, which is a very polite way of saying the building was on fire and the people in charge were arguing about the thermostat. That was the cover-up machine. That was supposed to be the wake-up call. That was supposed to change everything. Let me show you what happened next. I'm going to go through a list now, and I want you to count, because the BBC would very much like you to believe each of these was a one-off. Jimmy Savile, over 450 people reported abuse to police, 214 recorded criminal offences, 34. He abused at virtually every BBC premises where he worked for approximately 42 years. On BBC property alone, the Dame Janet Smith review identified 72 victims, including 8 rapes. The youngest victim was 10. He died with his reputation intact, never charged, never convicted, and the BBC put him on television for half a century. Next, Stuart Hall, convicted of 14 counts of indecent assault. He assaulted children at the BBC for 24 years, from 1967 to 1991. The Dame Janet Smith review found 21 victims connected to his BBC work, the youngest aged 10. Staff in BBC Manchester knew he was bringing underage girls to his dressing room. They knew. He served roughly 3 years in prison. That works out to be about 46 days per victim. Rolf Harris, convicted of 12 counts of indecent assault. Youngest victim was 7 or 8 years old. One victim was his daughter's childhood friend, abused from the age of 13 over multiple years. The BBC commissioned Harris to paint the Queen's portrait. When he was convicted, the BBC rejected calls for an inquiry, claiming his offences do not relate to the BBC. So that's three convicted abusers, decades of offending, hundreds of victims. And the BBC's line each time, nothing to do with us, but we're not done. Hugh Edwards, the face of BBC News for 20 years, anchored the Queen's death, the King's coronation, every major election, paid £475,000 a year of your money. In July 2024, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of making indecent images of 7 of those images were Category A, the most serious classification. He got a suspended sentence, walked free. And the BBC, they found out about his arrest in November 2023 and kept paying his salary. Approximately £200,000 of licence fee money handed to a man they knew had been arrested for abuse image offences. As of today, he hasn't given it back. And then there are the others. Mark Page, former Radio 1 presenter, sentenced to 18 years for arranging child sex offences in the Philippines. The judge called it the very embodiment of depravity. Ray Terrett, Savile's friend, convicted of 7 rapes and 11 indecent assaults. John Peel admitted on record to sexual contact with an awful lot of underage girls. One victim was 13, never investigated. Tim Westwood, accused in 2022. Allegations still unresolved. Count them. Go on, because every single one of these people was given a platform, an audience, and access to vulnerable people by the BBC. And every single time, the BBC's response was the same. Ooh, shock! An internal review. Promises of reform. Then it happened again. Now, every case I've just listed happened at an institution that you're forced by law to pay for. But before we get to how much, I want to talk about something I noticed while researching this video. When the Scott Mills story broke on Sunday, I did what I always do. I checked who was actually covering it. Within 24 hours, 142 news outlets had run the story. And of those 142, only 8 leaned right. 76% of the coverage came from centrist outlets, which raises an obvious question. When the story is about the BBC, who's holding them to account, and who's just reprinting the press release? I found that using Ground News. It's an app that pulls from over 50,000 sources worldwide and shows you who's covering a story, what their political lean is, and who owns them. For a video like this, where I'm stitching together decades of institutional failure, knowing which outlets are reporting what, and more importantly, what they're leaving out, changes the research entirely. The features I keep coming back to are the bias distribution and the media ownership data. That second one connects directly to something we'll get to later in this video. 3 companies control 90% of national newspaper circulation. Ground News shows you exactly who owns what you're reading. Now, I'm not a sponsor, right? I'm genuinely just recommending this, but I am an affiliate, which means that the channel earns a small commission if you subscribe through my link. Now that gives me some income, and that keeps this channel independent. Nobody tells me what to cover, what to say, or anything like that. So if you want to check out Ground News, then click the link in that description or the QR code on the screen. The Vantage plan gives you unlimited access to every feature, and I've managed to get you 40% off when you click on my link. Your subscription really supports this channel, and it really supports this small, independent team making media bias visible. Right, let's go back to the BBC, because everything I've just shown you about who's covering this story, the BBC had the same problem internally. They had the information, They had the complaints. They had the evidence. They just didn't want to look at it. And in 2016, a judge spent 4 years explaining exactly why. The Dame Janet Smith Review is probably the most damning official document ever written about a British public institution, and most people have never even heard of it. A retired Court of Appeal judge, over 700 pages, 380 witnesses, 4 years of investigation. And what she found was an organisation that was, by design, incapable of protecting children. Smith described a culture of not complaining inside the BBC. An atmosphere of fear that was so entrenched, witnesses during the inquiry itself would only participate if their identities were protected. They were afraid of the BBC during an inquiry into the BBC. Just think about that. The review found that BBC celebrities were treated as virtually untouchable. Dame Esther Ranson described the BBC as operating like a set of private armies, competing departments with no mechanism for sharing concerns. A predator who worked across departments, someone like Savile, could rack up complaints in different silos without anyone connecting the dots. HR was perceived as working for management, not for the staff it was supposed to protect. There was no effective route for reporting sexual misconduct. And on Stuart Hall specifically, the finding was even stronger than for Savile. Management in BBC Manchester were directly aware. Not junior staff, not middle managers having a bad day, but managers. 700 pages, 380 witnesses, a culture of fear, celebrity worship, and deliberate institutional blindness. And the BBC's own workplace review in 2025, after Savile, after Hall, after Harris, after Edwards, after Russell Brand, after Greg Wallace, after Jermaine Jenas, after the Strictly scandal, they're finding no evidence of a toxic culture. All right, that's sorted then. Cool. The Independent Inquiry into Child Abuse, IICSA, published its final report in October 2022 and made 20 recommendations on child protection. As of December 2024, the number that have been implemented. Guess again. It's 0. None. And if you think that's bad, wait until you see what they're making you pay for all of this. Yes, you. Every case I've just described happened inside an institution that you are compelled by criminal law to fund. £174.50 a year, rising to £180 from April. If you refuse, you can be prosecuted. If you don't pay the file, you could go to prison. 5 people were jailed for it in 2018. At its peak in 2014, 204,000 people were prosecuted in a single year for not paying the licence fee. 200,000 people. TV licence evasion accounts for roughly 1 in 8 of all cases in magistrates' courts. But the part that genuinely shocked me during research is this. 73 to 74% of all licence fee prosecutions are against women. Not a slim majority. Nearly 3/4. TV licence evasion is the #1 criminal offence that women are convicted of in England and Wales. It accounts for 12% of all female prosecutions. Think about that just for a moment. Among those prosecuted, a 57-year-old woman with Down syndrome, convicted, given a conditional discharge, and a 50-year-old woman with terminal breast cancer, also prosecuted. These are real people dragged through the criminal justice system for not funding an institution that harboured Jimmy Savile for half a century. Now, compare that to what happens when you're on the inside. Hugh Edwards was on nearly $500,000 a year. He was convicted of possessing Category A abuse images, the most serious kind, suspended sentence and walked free. The BBC kept paying him approximately £200,000 after they knew he'd been arrested. Meanwhile, the BBC spent £166 million on enforcement in 2024 to 2025, chasing the people who won't pay. £166 million hunting down licence fee refusers. And how much did the BBC spend investigating the complaints about Savile during his lifetime? Functionally nothing, because they didn't investigate them at all. The fee generates £3.84 billion in net income, a record high. Total BBC income, including its commercial arm, hits £5.9 billion. And the evasion rate, 12.52%, a 30-year high. Active licenses have dropped from 26.2 million in 2018 to 23.8 million. Combined with 3.6 million households declaring they don't need one, the BBC faces over £1.1 billion in lost annual income, more than a quarter of total licence fee revenue just gone. The BBC itself has admitted the current model is not sustainable and needs reform, so even they know this is finished. The question is what replaces it. And that question matters right now because the BBC's charter expires in 2027 and the government is already consulting on what comes next. Other countries have already answered this question, and the world didn't end. France scrapped its €138 a year broadcasting fee in August 2022, saved 23 million households the cost overnight. Denmark phased theirs out between 2019 and 2022 and replaced it with tax funding, accompanied by a 20% budget cut to the national broadcaster. Australia got rid of its version back in 1974. The pattern is consistent. Abolition delivers immediate relief to households, but creates long-term funding uncertainty for the broadcaster. Whether that trade-off is acceptable depends on whether you believe an institution with the BBC's record deserves protection from political pressure in the first place. The UK government launched a formal BBC Charter review in December 2025. A green paper is currently consulting on options: advertising on BBC platforms, a tiered subscription model, a paywall for premium content. The current charter expires at the end of 2027. A white paper is expected later this year. The Defund the BBC campaign has accumulated tens of thousands of supporters. The Appeal charity petition gathered 250,000 signatures calling for decriminalisation of non-payment, and the political mood has shifted. This is no longer a fringe argument. When even the BBC itself admits the model is broken, the conversation has moved on. The only people who haven't noticed are the ones still collecting the fee. But if we scrap the licence fee, what's left? Is there actually an independent alternative? The short answer is actually not yet, but the pieces are there. Let's be honest about where we are. 3 companies, DMG Media, News UK, and Reach, control 90% of national newspaper circulation. That concentration has actually increased by 20% since 2014. Nearly 300 local newspapers have closed since 2005. GB News, the supposed anti-establishment alternative, is primarily funded by hedge fund manager Sir Paul Marshall, who also owns The Spectator. It's racked up £141 million in losses since its launch and has the lowest trust rating of the 5 main news broadcasters, a net trust score of -15. Talk TV closed its linear channel in May 2024 after a £34 million loss in 1 year. Public trust in UK news sits at 35%, down 16 points since 2015. Only 19% of people think the BBC is not biased at all. Britain doesn't have an independent media. It has a choice between different owners. But there are models worth watching. The Guardian operates through the Scott Trust, editorial independence guaranteed in perpetuity, funded by readers. The Bristol Cable has 2,600 community members. The Ferret in Scotland runs entirely on crowdfunding. There are over 400 independent, hyper-local news providers operating outside the major chains. The infrastructure for something genuinely independent is emerging. It's small, it's underfunded, but it exists, and it doesn't require a criminal offence to pay for it. So, the BBC harboured, enabled, and protected child abusers for 6 decades. Every time it was exposed, they commissioned a review. Every review said never again. Every time, it happened again. 8 complaints about Savile, 0 investigated. The government's independent inquiry into sexual abuse made 20 recommendations, not a single one implemented. And through all of it, the British public was forced to pay, by law, on pain of criminal prosecution. Disproportionately women, disproportionately vulnerable people, while convicted sex offenders walked free and kept their salary. The BBC Charter expires in 2027. The government is reviewing the funding model right now. This is the window. And now you have the full picture, the pattern, the evidence, The numbers. You can articulate exactly why the compulsory funding model is morally indefensible. So use it. If this video made you angry, good. Share it with someone who still pays the licence fee and thinks the BBC sorted this out after Savile. Newsflash, they didn't. If you want to take action, look up Defund the BBC or the Appeal Campaign for Decriminalisation. Or check out Rupert Lowe and Restore Britain.